Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you to another session of the Lise Meitner Research Group's lecture series, China, the New Science Superpower, in collaboration with the Berlin Contemporary China Network. My name is Annalisa Ahlers. I'll quickly go through some housekeeping rules before I introduce today's topic and our speaker. It's an interactive Zoom room, as you can see. We will keep ourselves muted for the beginning while Professor Meyer is giving his presentation. We will then have plenty of time for Q&A in the end. You can use the hand raise function or put something in the chat that I will then read out. You can also, while Professor Meyer is talking, of course, post something in the chat that we can pick up later again in the Q&A. Camera, it's up to you whether you choose to keep it on or not. We'll record the presentation and post it on the BCCN's YouTube channel later, where you can also find the videos of our previous talks. So we've talked over the past few months a lot about the internal structures of the Chinese science system as it has evolved over the past decades. We've also looked into a few of the new structures that are emerging in international collaboration that involves the People's Republic of China. Today, we have a very exciting new addition to this overview. Maximilian Meyer of the University of Bonn will talk about China's space science and technology. If you're familiar with sociology of science, you could say maybe that is a new strategic research site that the PRC is exploring. It has also drawn a lot of attention because of the developments in recent years that the PRC was able to achieve, and we'll hear about that in a minute. I'm very happy that we have Maximilian Meyer with us today, our distinguished speaker. Maximilian is an assistant professor at the University of Bonn of International Relations and Global Politics of Technology. He has held various very exciting positions before coming to Bonn, where he initially did his BA and master's, or a PhD, it also was. I think he's one of the few scholars who has, from Europe, who has firsthand experiences of working at an academic institution in the PRC. He was working at the University of Nottingham Ningbo, also as assistant professor for several years between 2019 and 2020. So he also has that experience. His main research areas are combining China studies with, I might say, STS, mostly also political science questions, international relations theories. He has so many publications that I will use all our time today to read them all to you, but I can at least mention a few of his book titles. One is China's Energy Thirst, Myth or Reality of 2007. Another one, 2 volumes actually, are about the global politics of science and technology. He wrote about the art and sovereignty in global politics and about rethinking the Silk Road, China's Belt and Road Initiative and emerging Eurasian relations. So you can see this very broad portfolio that Maximilian is covering. And he is also an expert on today's topic, space science and technology. And without further ado, I'm very happy to hand over the floor to him, and I look forward to his presentation. Thanks, Maximilian, for coming.
Yeah, hello, Anna. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here, and thanks a lot for the invitation to speak about this perhaps pretty exotic topic. As Anna just said, I might be seen as an expert on that topic, even so I'm not doing for years research on that. So it's just the last 2 years, actually, we have started to do research on that, simply because it's the topic of space and space technologies is connected to a lot of other fields of research, connected to the Belt and Road Initiative, and connected, broadly speaking, to China's role as an infrastructure provider or as a builder of infrastructure. And that's how at least I got into that field as well, because if you follow the the traces of digital infrastructures and others, then you suddenly always bump into space-related things. And of course, space research on space is also very exciting because there's so many things happening in this field, and I cannot cover all of these dimensions, but I will allude to various elements of that, which is typically referred to as the new space, as compared to the Cold War kind of old space, where you had a limited number of actors, very state-centric, but in a new space you have new types of missions, new types of actors, many private actors, and of course the politics of China's space science and space programs has to be seen in that light of the greater trends in space development and in the development of space technologies, broadly speaking. So let me just outline for a moment what I'm going to present in the next 45 minutes or so. First of all, I try to map a little bit the expanding of China's space assets and infrastructures. There's many things which might be quite surprising for some of you, other things you know from media reporting, but that's a kind of empirical way into that thing to understand better the global reach of it, and the different technological dimensions of it. And then next, I try to find some answers to the question, what is driving that? What are the major factors behind that? How can we actually explain why the Chinese government is spending a lot of taxpayer money and taxpayer resources to move into this field? And related to that, of course, I also try to tease out a little bit the different framings of Chinese space power. So there's various views on that. Some are very critical, some are very positive, some are very skeptical. So I try to get to sort of contextualize that a little bit more in the against the background of global relations and of China's rise. And then the next three elements is sort of looking at the tensions, you might say, or contradictions in there, that you have a tension between geopolitical factors and at the same time collaborative science diplomacy that's developing a site, and that's creating some really interesting research puzzles and questions which are not easy to solve. And then maybe just a quick look at specifically at China's role for many countries in the global south, where China is becoming one of the most important partners for space technology and space program development. And then a question which is more pointing towards different approaches of governance. The Chinese space program and space industry development is very state-centric. I will go into this later more in detail. And that seems to be in contradiction and maybe in competition with an US model, which is much more driven by private companies. And the question, of course, for the future is which model is going to win, or which model is going to be more successful. And we have some indications to answer this question, even though, of course, it's too early. And in the end, I will also try to at least allude to some of the broader conclusions, but also looking from a European point of view, what this actually means for the European Space Agency and European ambitions in space. Okay, so let me start with this kind of more broader observations. We can clearly see that China is a latecomer in space. We have the great spacefaring countries, including the US, of course, and Soviet Union, later Russia, but also the European Space Agency, which have a much longer tradition and have developed a lot of technologies. And China is just in the process of catching up extremely quickly. The main elements of the manned space program in China have started basically in the early 1990s. And from that on, there was a pretty fast development and very much on track. So the major milestones have been realized almost according to plan. So that's quite something. It's a tremendous success actually of the program, given that there's a lot of elements which have been developed inside China, which have been based on, for example, Russian technologies and others, but then really going into indigenous types of innovation. So there's quite some jump in a way on the level of science and technology here, which can be observed in that field. And as part of such an evolving development, as I will detail in a minute, there is actually a lot of global technologies, global infrastructures required. So in order to have such a big space program, you cannot just operate from your own territory. You need a lot of things in place around the planet to make this work. And naturally, as the entire perception of China's rise has turned from a more optimistic, positive towards a more negative, skeptical perception, you have tied into this expanding space capabilities and space program by China. You have a lot of concerns driven by geopolitical consideration, the issue of the potential militarization of space, and national security concerns, which dominate quite a lot of research, especially the major research, you could say, communities dealing with China's space power outside of China are in the US, and they are driven mostly by national security concerns. But at the same time, it's really important to not look at China's space science and technology only through a US lens and only through the lens of national security. It's important to recognize that China is collaborating with many countries around the world. There's a growing number, especially countries in the global south, and China became a massive supporter in terms of technology transfer, in terms of knowledge transfer, but simply also in terms of providing access to space for many countries around the world. So it's not just an issue of geopolitics or competing hegemonic agendas, which not only are driving cyberspace and cybersecurity issues, but also in space. Chinese space power goes far beyond that. And then, of course, we can ask the question, and that's sort of my background question for this talk, maybe too simplistic, but I think it's still a worthwhile exercise to ask, is it likely that we see a competition, an intensification of a competition, and which kind of areas technologically, politically, commercially will be actually the most competitive? And could that competition sort of translate even into military conflict or into a further larger militarization of space development and of activities in space? Yeah, let's start with the mapping. This is a graph based on research from one of my PhD students, Konhan Lee, who's working in Nottingham University in Ningbo. And he's, among other things, comparing the US, Chinese, and Russian space programs. And he has collected data about space launches over the years since 1957. And we see a quite, unsurprising development. We see the two main space powers, Russia and the US, of course, dominating that during the Cold War. And at the end of the Cold War, after 1989, 1990, there's a drop in the Soviet Union or Russia, and also on the US side, you see a sort of low-level development. And the red thread here is the launches by China, and you see here a constant increase. And in the last couple of years, China has more launches per year than both Russia and the US. So it shows a clear sort of ascent of Chinese access to space and massive resources, obviously, which have to be invested to achieve that on the one hand, but also assets which can be placed into Earth's orbit or into other places in space, because there are more Chinese launches. And I will come back to this graph. It's just for the beginning, so we can read this in a more skeptical and critical way, but I think there's a clear trend visible here. What are the main elements of China's space program? There's quite a number of them. One is the tracking system, transmission, tracking, and command system, which you need for operating any movable entity, like a rocket or a spacecraft, in order to steer it, in order to monitor it, in order to collect the data for governing it. And this requires a comprehensive tracking system, which is, as I already mentioned, not just within the Chinese territory, but which needs to have a global reach. And the other larger space nations also have such tracking systems, the US, of course, but also the European Space Agency, Japan, India, for example. Sometimes they're using also the same stations actually to do that work. Right? And then you have a military component, which is in a way the oldest one, or which is the one who was already long before the manned, the human space program, which is of course for military use. And in the 90s, you have the start of additional elements which go beyond military use, which are civilian use of space assets and civilian goals. First of all, of course, you need a transport system to get into space. That's the rocket, the carrier rocket Long March, which has been developed in various stages over time, and has become one of the most successful and effective instruments to carry humans, assets, whatnot into space. In addition to that transport system, there are various satellite-based infrastructures. The one you perhaps know best is the Beidou system, the navigation system, which is similar like the GPS system or the European Galileo system. But there's also special satellite system for remote sensing and for broadcasting. It means basically television broadcasting. That's a pretty comprehensive infrastructure, and this is used, of course, also in a dual way, both for the military, but also for many civilian users, for logistics, for transports, such as in fisheries, for example. And the next one is the actual manned spaceflight missions and programs, the so-called Shenzhou missions, which have been developed basically following the American example step by step, and have succeeded to put Chinese taikonauts into space. And coupled to that is the Chinese space station, the Tiangong or Tianhe, which follows the example of the International Space Station with the goal to create a permanent habitat in Earth's orbit, which can be manned by researchers, by taikonauts, and so forth. And this space station actually has been finalized just by the end of last year and is now operating and has a permanent crew. I will talk more about this later, because it's quite interesting to understand how China operates this International Space Station. The Chinese space station is a window into understanding how China as a space power is collaborating with other nations and what are the limitations of this collaboration. And then beyond the closer, like Earth, the space close to Earth, the Earth orbit, you have, of course, also the goals of deep space exploration. That's going to the moon, going to the Mars, and beyond. And here also China has a quite ambitious program, in a way, in a competition with the US and others, to build a research base on the moon, and use the moon also as a stepping stone to go further to Mars and other places in the solar system. So that's pretty ambitious, and at the moment there's a lot of funding going in that direction, and a lot of steps taken where China is the first nation to do that ever. For example, a Chinese spacecraft landed on the other side, on the so-called dark side of the moon, which has been a first, not just for China, but for the whole humanity. A look into China shows us that there are 4 launching bases, and the newest one is the one in Hainan, that's very much in the south of China. So there have been already only a couple of launches. The other ones in Western China and in central China and southern China, they have quite a number of launches already successfully. So that's a pretty impressive number of bases. In addition, as I already mentioned, there's this global network, this so-called China Deep Space Network, which is, by the way, because of the institutional tradition of that, starting from the military tracking ballistic intercontinental missiles, which is run by by an entity which belongs to the People's Liberation Army, especially the strategic space, strategic support force for space systems. And this entity also at the moment is in charge of all the civilian starts and the non-military activities as well. These stations are, and just following down the rabbit hole of this network a little bit. So you have tracing stations inside China, for example, in Shandong province in Qingdao, or in Xiamen in the south in Fujian province, or far in the west in Xinjiang. But you have also ground stations in other countries in the world, for example, in Pakistan, in Namibia, as well as in Australia and Sweden. And you have a couple of tracking vessels, like this one, for example. That's the Yuanwang 2, here an old photo from 2005, anchoring in New Zealand in Auckland Harbour. And this is, there's a number of these vessels. I think it should be around 8 or 9 operating at the moment, and they are a maritime basis, tracking satellites, missiles, but also tracking the space station and the manned space missions. So China has this kind of combination of terrestrial ground stations in other countries, in addition to these ships. Okay, so far for first mapping. There is, of course, more to say about that, but for the sake of time and not to go into too much detail, that should be suffice to understand that this is a pretty comprehensive infrastructure which is needed and which is also constantly evolving. So there is a new a plan to build a new ground base in Antarctica, for example, to improve the monitoring capabilities in the southern hemisphere, and there might be others, for example, in the Middle East, linked to a new spaceport which is supposed to be built by a Chinese private investment company in Djibouti. So what is driving this expansion? How can we explain that? And I'm referring here, of course, to lots of research and literature about Chinese foreign policy and especially Chinese space policy and its evolution over time. And there's classical explanations offered in the literature. One is the question of prestige and status. So as China is driven, and perhaps a lot of Chinese foreign policy is driven to gain back its legitimate place in world politics and its kind of self-understanding as one of the central powers in the world, a space program is an absolute must to have. It's a marker for status, and it's also a way to show leadership, for example, by providing public goods to other countries around the world. So this is a strong explanation, I think, and certainly there's a lot of thinking and rationale behind that is indeed driven by this kind of status or seeking behavior on the Chinese side. You might compare, for example, China with Japan or China with India, two other countries which have very strong space programs. those space programs are by far not as ambitious as the Chinese one. So the amount of public funding and budget allocated for these for the Japanese and the Indian space program is much less than for the Chinese, which shows perhaps that both nations are less driven by status concerns and maybe have a more kind of you could say instrumental understanding of how much they want to spend for these kind of technologies. But it goes beyond that, of course. So there's a more, you could say, social constructivist understanding, which is not looking for status and identity, but which also looking for dreams and ambitions. And I'm going into that in a minute a bit more. What I mean by that is certainly something which is a powerful driver, especially also in the Chinese public, which is strongly supporting the space program. And there's a lot of interaction, there's a lot of public science going on. Chinese taikonauts have been teaching live from the space station towards Chinese students and so on. So there's a strong engagement with the Chinese public. That's not something which is just, you could say, a secretive elite project which nobody knows about. This is actually pretty open, and there's a lot of science communication going on within China about the space program. Which is certainly not the case for many other fields, right? So there's less communication about AI development, for example, right? By far less, and the attempt to have public engagement. There's other drivers beyond that. So one simple explanation is there are technical capabilities, and there's a strong innovation drive in different fields, and that's spilling over into the space field as well. So you see innovations in various technical fields, and I'm sure as part of this lecture series you have been looking into different fields, and everywhere you find a very strong innovation drive and the idea to experiment, to try things out, and the state itself sees itself as a major pusher for inventions and innovations, and that's also true for space, of course. In that sense, this itself is also driving space expansion. But then you can go beyond that, and you can understand the Chinese state as a type of a modern infrastructural state, which creates infrastructures in all kinds of different fields and sectors, almost as a second nature. And with the space station, with the space program, I have pointed out this earlier already, there is a strong link with the Belt and Road and with infrastructures built around the world by Chinese investments or by Chinese companies. And especially the digital elements of these are having a strong link to satellite systems and to communication systems. So there's a natural combination of Chinese tech companies creating 5G networks, building undersea cables, providing services in terms of connectivity, and the capability to also have a satellite system like a Beidou system, which can be used by a lot of cell phones around the world, which can be used to connect smartphones and Internet of Things applications and so forth. So there's a natural connection. In a way, you could almost say there is no Chinese global infrastructure projects, especially in the digital field, which don't have a space element. So this goes together. This is really strongly coupled. You couldn't do one without the other. And so this is sort of you might say, a characteristic of the modern Chinese state and of the system to build infrastructures, not just within China, but also terrestrially around the world, and as well as in space, and soon perhaps also on the moon and on other planets even. Aside from this internal drive, you could say, there's also a couple of external stimulants and external dimensions. One is the sort of earlier geopolitics. So in some sense, the tension we see and the technological decoupling between the US and China has first developed with regard to space technology, long time ago. And China has been excluded because of a US decision to participate in the International Space Station already for over a decade. China has also been sort of excluded from having more access to American satellite technology and doing starts with satellite because of a scandal at the end of the 90s already. So in the field of space, you see a technological decoupling while China was still cooperating with Europe, for example. There was a cooperation, for instance, to create and to use together the Galileo system, but also much more intensive cooperation with Russia, which is still going on. So in some sense, in the space field, you have an early example of the kind of technology war or the technology tensions we see playing out much broader in various fields today. And that is, of course, linked, and that's perhaps the last and important driver to defense matters, to national security, and to the development of military capabilities, which are, and I'm talking here about potential space military capabilities, which are both important for war and defense on Earth, but also might be in the future relevant for potential military conflicts or at least military constellations in space. And there's one key moment, and I just refer to that, when there was a conflict in the Taiwan Strait in the middle 90s, then the US switched off the GPS signal for the Chinese military and for other Chinese applications for just 2 days. And this kind of switching off, which was sort of legally, because the back then the GPS system was always under the condition that it could be switched off in a military conflict moment. But this experience to have nothing in the moment when the US government decides it switches off the GPS is a key, was a turning point on the Chinese side to think about maybe building its own global satellite system. And now, like almost 20 years later, we have a fully developed satellite system, which makes China and Chinese actors around the world, and many others include as well, which are using the system, independent, autonomous from American, European, and Russian satellite infrastructure. So there is also this drive for autonomy, which is related to national defense and to a broader idea of self-reliance. Let's jump back maybe quickly to the question of leadership, which is one of the driving factors. I think China wants to be a leader in that field. And maybe the most striking case of this leadership is the Chinese space station. If the International Space Station is going to be decommissioned, and that's very likely happening soon, maybe in 2 years, maybe in 3 years, then China is the only nation or the only actor who has an operating, active, working space station. So anyone who wants to do research in space has to collaborate with China or can't do this research. And this is it's not just a power position, but it's also showing leadership in a time when neither Russia nor the US has this kind of asset. And there's also at the moment no plan actually to create another international space station. So this might go on for 10 or 15 years. And it would mean a very strong leadership sign for China. I'm saying more later about who is collaborating with China on using the space station for research. And it is clear that that's not only the European partners or East Asian partners, but it's also a lot of partners from the Global South, which are invited to do their research on the space station. The reference to a dream is also to be found by the Chinese president himself. There is a China space program, or kind of a white paper about space, which was published roughly 2 years ago. And it starts with a quotation from Xi Jinping, who is saying to explore the vast cosmos, develop space industry, and build China into a space power is our eternal dream. So he's referring here, of course, also to the whole narrative of the China dream, which is an overarching theme, how Xi is framing his vision for the country and his vision for China's future. But he's specifically referring here to a space dream, right? And you might say, well, that's just sort of propaganda slogans, and that links into the larger propaganda of the Chinese Communist Party. But I think there's more to that. And just to point out one example, there is a long popular culture and tradition in China to think about space, and there is a strong sci-fi literature, especially emerging in the 1990s. Some of these books, like the one I'm referring here to on the right side, the so-called three-body problem, Santi, has become a major globally influential book. And it just shows that if the Chinese president articulates a space dream for China, that this is not just his personal dream, this can be shared and is shared by many millions of Chinese. So there's a strong, explains why there's also strong public support, and shows that the Chinese space program is not just something geopolitical or military driven, but it's also a techno-cultural or cultural techno construction of the future of the Chinese nation. From that more cultural perspective, let me go back to the geopolitics versus governance tension. And what we see here is quite something, I think, interesting. And for me, as a scholar of international relations, also this provides a lot of really good research puzzles. So one research puzzle is, of course, the concern with militarization. We see that mainly starting in 2007, when China conducted its first and only anti-satellite test, shooting down one of its own satellites. And that was perceived in the US as a show of military capabilities, and not necessarily in a positive way, of course, because satellites are a critical element of the US surveillance and monitoring capabilities. And if China is able to shoot down a satellite, then it can also threaten or maybe even deny the use of high precision weapons by the US, which have to rely on a functioning satellite system. And this was in 2007. So if you go fast forward to today's discussion, then we, of course, are in a totally different world. Cybersecurity, critical infrastructure are central now to our discussions and are even driving economic considerations and driving ideas of decoupling and so forth. So that kind of initial concern about Chinese capabilities in terms of shooting down satellites have been multiplied and are now a central issue. It's, of course, interesting that China didn't do this a second time, so they just did it one time. So it's hard to say whether the perception here is going far beyond the actual intention or the military use even of that kind of capabilities. But there's more than that. So I have already referred to the 1990s. There was a back then famous report by a Republican congressman, Christopher Cox, and the Cox report has detailed all kinds of Chinese and partially alleged Chinese spying activities, including the illegal transfer of knowledge and re-engineering and so forth of satellites and satellite systems. So this discussion that the Chinese space program is a national security matter is not something new. This goes back at least to the mid and 90s, right, in the US context. So the more recent events, the spy balloon saga and other elements are in a way repeating similar observations, repeating similar concerns, however, under radical different conditions, because in the 90s, no one was expecting that China could be a peer competitor economically, technologically, and so forth. But now China in the US is seen as a peer competitor. So these kind of events, of course, have a totally different status and totally different meaning in terms of the bilateral tensions between the US and China. There's other examples just to point this out. So as part of the larger like skeptical view on Chinese technology, and especially on Chinese space technologies, because of its potential military use. Some of the countries which have provided China access to ground stations, such as Sweden and Australia, have withdrawn this offer. So China can no longer, the space program can no longer rely on these kind of ground stations. So also on the Earth or on the terrestrial arena, you see the space geopolitics is playing out as well. It's not just something about space, but it's also about the entire infrastructure, which, as I have shown before, spans the whole globe. But the picture is a bit more complicated. So let me dive quickly into two case studies we have been recently finishing and published. And these case studies are comparing two pillars of the Chinese space program. One is the Chinese space station, which I've already mentioned, and the other one is the planned, not yet realized, moon base, a lunar research station, which doesn't have any military applications, which is purely for research purposes, which is planned to be built during the next 10 to 15 years. And you could say, well, that's the same administration, the Chinese Space Administration is building these, is designing these, is in charge of these. So there's no military connection there. But you see that they are actually quite different in the way how China has tried to attract partners and attract other governments and other space agencies to collaborate. And that's an interesting puzzle, because you might just expect, well, there should be a relatively similar strategy to attract partners. So if you compare these two, and I'm not going into too much detail here, the Chinese space station here on the left side follows very strongly established United Nations channels and formats and procedures, both for the design of the space station, opening up about all the details, but also for the application procedures for possible research to be done in the future on the space station. And there's a handbook published, which was written together with the key United Nations UNOSA institution in this field. There was a transparent process to select research projects. There were international researchers involved in the selection process, and the overall framing of the Chinese space station was also following the United Nations narratives here as access to space for all, also known as the AS4A initiative. So this is all very consistent, and that has been accepted by other space faring nations, and it has a very legitimate sort of development. And if you compare that with the lunar base, there's a striking difference. So in case of the lunar base, there was hardly any transparency. There was not any involvement of United Nations institutions. There were only two actors involved, China and Russia, which have signed a memorandum of understanding to create the station, but we don't have a lot of detail. There is a handbook published, but the handbook is much less detailed. It doesn't have clear, transparent procedures. And so the entire approach is totally different. And one of the results is also, or part of the story is that in the case of the lunar base, quite different from the Chinese space station, China has not been successfully attracted other actors to collaborate. So there's maybe one or two are considering, like the Arab Emirates considering to participate, but nothing happened so far. So there's really different cases. And so the question for me was then, how can we explain that? How is it possible that we have so different approaches and also different outcomes of these kind of science collaboration or jointly building and using space assets? And so this is an interesting puzzle for an international relations scholar. How can you explain that? And one idea we had how to explain that was that this could be driven by something which is sort of the institutional environment, what we call the institutional density, in which certain space collaborations are unfolding. So the idea is that if there's a high density, then the space diplomacy by China, but also by other actors, would follow that highly institutionalized environment and use these institutions because they create incentives and path dependencies, and it's very difficult to not work inside these existing institutions, their norms and procedures and so forth. But if that's not the case, and on the moon, as we will see in a minute, that's exactly what we're finding actually, then that's more difficult. There's more room and also more need to follow a different path. And there's a second issue, and I'm not going more into that, but it's also, I think, highly fascinating for everyone interested more in moon, the development of activities on the moon and on other planets. If you look at the moon, the situation of acting there, of doing something, is quite different from the space station. Because in case of the space station, or in case of satellites and all kind of orbiting assets, there is almost no issues of sovereignty, of territory, of property rights, and so forth. But as soon as you have to touch down on a surface, like on a moon surface, suddenly you have questions of sovereignty, territory, property, and so forth. And also, we have a moon treaty. The major spacefaring nations like the US and so forth haven't signed the moon treaty. So they don't accept the only existing institutional framework which is there. And that means everyone can basically invent their own institutions, right? Or invent their own norms, how to act and how to behave. And that's the kind of second element, that building a moon base as compared to the International Space Station is not just different because the existing institutional frameworks are different, less dense, but also because the issues emerging on the moon are much more complicated and are much more difficult to govern than everything related to a space station orbiting Earth. So this is just from our article, and I'm not going here into detail, but this just shows you there is quite some institutional frameworks for how nations and how actors, including private actors, are operating in space and in outer space, and you could say superficially seen, they also apply on the moon. Especially the moon treaty is important here. However, it's not acknowledged by major by major actors which want to do something on the moon. And also, we don't have precedents for what's happening on the moon. So in the case of the Chinese space station, a lot of the way they built, designed the station, the way they invited participants or invited potential collaborating partners could follow examples such as the International Space Station. But in the case of the moon, we don't have these kind of examples. So there is more room, you could say, for creativity, or it's more difficult actually to achieve consensus on basis of which norms, on basis on which procedures one can have activities there. So there are lessons from these mini case studies, and I'm not diving more into that because of time constraints. But if you want, you can also read this in our article in more detail. But I think there's one of the most crucial lessons is that with regard to space science and to space science diplomacy, we can clearly see that China is a status quo power. China follows clearly the institutionalized settings and procedures within the United Nations framework and within the United Nations treaties. However, if these frameworks don't fully apply, or if these frameworks are less dense, less established, contested maybe even, such as on the moon, we see different behavior. So we see a behavior which follows much more great power, zero-sum thinking, intransparent, and also less successful if you count the success of attracting other partners. In that sense, the Chinese space program is an example of kind of a very ambiguous or maybe even bifurcated diplomacy, which I think we find also in other fields as well, right? You have this mix of realpolitik, this mix of zero-sum thinking on the one hand, and on the other hand, a clear following, a clear behavior which is inside the framework of the United Nations. And this will be relevant for the future, because if there's more activities on the moon, on other planets, we are perhaps confronted with a China which is following more the second pattern and less the first pattern, right? Which follows more the power politics, intransparent and so forth, and less the United Nations frameworks. And by the way, this is not just a China issue here. I mean, I'm just making here this footnote. This is also something we see emerging with the Artemis program of the United States, right? Which follows also, at least some international lawyers would argue, so follows a different kind of pattern. So in some sense, the Chinese space station is perhaps the best case, whereas the moon research, the planned moon research base, is perhaps sort of the future, which is saying that these kind of non-collaborative approach, or let's say more driven by purely national interest, less open, less sharing, and so forth, might be kind of the future of the Chinese space program outside of Earth's orbit, right? Yeah, but as long as we are not there, and of course, nobody can predict the future, what we also can observe at the same time, and I think this is quite an important element, which is overseen by a lot of people, is that the connection between the Belt and Road Initiative and space technologies has been pointed out by many, but what is overseen often is that the public goods which are delivered here from China to many other countries in the global south is quite important, and is seen by a lot of actors in the global south as a proof of not just of Chinese friendship, but also of the advantage China delivers to these countries. This is a photo of the observatory station, space observatory station in the capital from Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is a country example which has a very ambitious space program and great goals, and has developed its own 2 satellites with help of the Chinese Space Agency. There was a lot of knowledge transfer going on, so Ethiopian engineers would go to Beijing and design together with Chinese engineers their own satellite. And what we know from interviews in Ethiopia, which is also very interesting, this is not something which China is doling out in a way that you have to take what you get. In fact, the idea to build a satellite was negotiated when the new Ethiopian prime minister was going in 2018 to Beijing, and this project was proposed, and then China wanted to deliver a climate focused satellite which looks for climate data, and the Ethiopian side, negotiating directly with the Chinese president, was saying, no, we want a general purpose sensory satellite type which does much more, which can collect more data than just climate data. And the Chinese side conceded and accepted that request and built that satellite. And this shows in a way that there is a lot of critique against China, that this is just rhetoric and that there's hierarchies and there's a new kind of technological dependencies developing. All of that might be true. However, at least in the case of Ethiopia, we also find that countries which technologically are much less developed than China have still the power to negotiate for the things they want to have. And that should give quite a pause to the European Space Agency, and also to the Americans in the way how they deal and how they collaborate with the space programs of countries in the global south. Outside of the UN channels, and China is very strong present, of course, in all kinds of space agencies and space-related treaties and institutions, we find also a lot of bi- and minilateral cooperation formats, especially maybe most important one is the Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization, in which China plays a leading role and is also organizing and providing knowledge transfer and collaboration, especially with developing countries, which are part of this organization. But there's more. We also find the space element strongly in the BRICS, and the BRICS as a group is evolving at the moment, so there might be also some countries from the Middle East joining. You see also in the G20 activities, but also within, of course, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and many other bilateral corporations, especially with African countries, providing satellites and so forth and other services. So China has become a major provider of public goods through various channels. It's UN channels, but it's also many emerging bilateral and unilateral channels. China has, of course, also asked, and there's a demand to help to solve the problem of space garbage. And that's a huge issue. And so far, I think there's a lot of critique leveled against China, probably that it's not doing enough. Might be really the case, but there's also some technological innovations coming out of China to try to deal with that quite severe problem. I don't have time to go into that, but the space debris issue could potentially hinder almost any kind of space flight in the future if we don't get a solution for that, because there's so many particles swirling around. And this is a visualization by the Astrea graph by University of Texas. And there's many other similar kind of visualizations, which just shows the amount of debris and assets flowing around. And given the enormous amount of small, tiny satellites in a lower Earth orbit, this problem is just increasing dramatically. So no solution in sight. China has to be part of that solution as well, and certainly has to do more to help solving that. A quick word on the question of competition. So the major, you could say, factors behind the competition in space are three factors. It's new technologies, it's new actors, and it's also new types of missions, including asteroid mining and so forth. And it's also, perhaps mirroring other policy fields, the competition between a more private market-based approach versus a state-centric approach. And maybe I finish my talk with just going back to that initial graph here. So you know this already. This shows the numbers of space launches, and the red line is China's launches per year, and China has overtaken the original grand space powers, US and Soviet Union or Russia. However, we can read this in a different way. So this numbers is just the number of a space launch, but the relevance of a space launch is A, what does it cost, and B, how much payload can it send into space. And if you look into the payload, and that's very interesting, again, thanks to Kunhan for this data, then you see that even though China has overtaken the US in terms of yearly launches, the payloads speak a different language. So the US has much more payload, actually, which is able to bring into space than China. So this shows in a way the inefficiency of the Chinese system, or not the Chinese system, the Chinese space program, because it can't put as much payload as the US into space with even a higher number of launches. And if you look at the costs, this is, I think, also very important. This is a graph from our World in Data, which compares the costs of launching with different systems, right? And that's a logarithmic graph. So it's not a linear graph, right? It's important to point that out. And if you, let me just try to use the laser pointer here. So the Chinese rocket systems would be here, for example, Long March 3 and Long March 5 and so forth. Where's the European one? The Ariane is here. That's an old one. Probably is the newer one. So they are much higher than the SpaceX systems. Look where the SpaceX systems are. The newer SpaceX systems likely is below $1,000 per kilogram. Long March is almost $8,000 or $9,000 per kilogram. It's a massive difference. So there's a competition issue here, right? If the Chinese Space Agency or other private actors are not able to reduce the costs of their payload, of their launches, then they are significantly disadvantaged in this global competition. Right? And SpaceX is, of course, an American company, so this benefits a lot the American military and many other users in the US who are using this kind of service. So here comes the competition element, in which you could say, well, quantitatively, maybe the Chinese have achieved something, but if you look on the quality level, the efficiency level, maybe the Chinese space program is less impressive than it might seem. So this brings me to my conclusion, and I've certainly already talked too long, so I make this quick. It's very basic conclusion is, yeah, Chinese space program has made enormous steps, and I think a lot of people wouldn't have expected that 10 years ago. And there's no reason not to assume that this could also go on in the next 10 years. So we should, given the amount of research, given the amount of funding, the amount of ambition and drive by the Chinese leadership, I don't see a reason why this should just stop, right? And then the second point is, I hope that became clear, China is providing a crucial space-based global infrastructure for digitalization and for logistics, especially in the global south, but also around the world. And that's creating technological redundancies, and is actually making a lot of systems safer and more secure and more stable. What is about the question of military dominance? I think at the moment it's unlikely that we see a militarization of space, but we will see a more strong, a greater and a stronger competition, both for technologies and innovations, but also for partners and profits. So this will be the driving forces. And here you see a mixed success on the Chinese side, right? You see the space station, which is perhaps the best case in terms of attracting partners and also in showing actual leadership, because China will be the only country having a space station for quite some years. So this is quite successful. If you take the moon base, China has failed to attract actually other actors, right? And the moon case, of course, also points to the second level, that the Chinese space technology and space science is very much driven by China-US competition and tensions. That's a major issue. And both countries are developing, like in other fields, so there's no exception here, more and more mutually exclusive pattern. Right, so China can't participate in the Artemis program. The US can't participate in China's moon base. So scientific cooperation on the moon and beyond that on other planets will likely follow more a realpolitik, zero-sum kind of thinking than the model of the Chinese space station. Right, that's the best case. We unlikely going to see that case or that kind of model playing out on the moon and elsewhere. So there's more secrecy, there's more absence of UN-based procedures and so forth. And some scholars are already talking about the so-called constitutional multipolarity. That means that space law is no longer one uniform set of laws, but there might be various parallel systems of laws applying in space. Another question, which becomes, I think, very central for the Chinese leadership, but of course also for analysts, how is the state-centric approach to Chinese space industry, is that actually a big disadvantage? And let's say that the litmus test, which is crucial, is the question of, is China able, and are Chinese space agencies or private companies able to reduce the costs of space launches? At the moment, US companies have a clear advantage, a massive advantage. So to close that gap, that's one of the key races. If we talk about a space race, then we should look at this kind of stuff. And last but not least, Europe's position in the context of this competition is getting weaker. And especially given that there are many new capabilities and infrastructures, some of them Chinese, but there's also other players there. And Europe really didn't come up with an answer, a response to that. So European Space Agency is really lagging behind in positioning itself strategically in this growing emergence of non-European, non-Western space infrastructures. And it's going to be quite interesting how the Zeitenwende für the European Space Agency will actually play out in terms of possible shift in strategy. And with that, thanks for listening, and I give back to Anna.